This course covers information concerning entry into permit-required confined spaces. You will learn the basics of confined space permit procedures, entry and monitoring requirements, role of the supervisor, attendant, and entrant, ventilation requirements, and rescue procedures. To protect you and others, all confined spaces that pose a danger are classified as permit-required confined spaces. This means that before anyone is allowed to enter the space, an entry permit must be completed. This entry permit ensures that all hazards have been controlled before entry and that only qualified workers enter the area. A permit-required confined space must not be entered unless there is a completed, signed permit posted or readily available for review. To aid in the preparation of an entry permit, each permit-required confined space has been evaluated for hazards and acceptable entry conditions. This assessment details the entry points and equipment needed, physical and atmospheric hazards, how hazards are controlled or eliminated, atmospheric monitoring requirement, specific entry procedures, ventilation requirements, equipment that requires lockout, tagout, rescue procedures, and all other safety requirements. The entry permit contains the following information: purpose, date, and how long the entry will last, names of entrants, attendants, and supervisors, hazards of the permit space, results of initial and periodic tests, means used to isolate the space, methods used to eliminate or control hazards, acceptable entry conditions, equipment to be used in the space, rescue procedures, and any other additional permits needed, such as for welding or other types of hot work. It is the responsibility of the entry supervisor to ensure the entry permit is properly completed and issued before allowing anyone inside the confined space. The conditions that must be met before entry are called the acceptable entry conditions. These are determined by the hazard assessment and the supervisor in charge of the entry and must be established before entry. Acceptable entry conditions define the safest atmospheric and physical conditions of the space and cannot be changed without a new entry permit. A part of the acceptable entry conditions includes the required atmospheric conditions in the confined space. An example of acceptable atmospheric conditions might include oxygen level of 19.5 to 23%, no explosive gas concentrations, no toxic fumes or vapors above allowed levels, and ventilation established and maintained. If any atmospheric conditions in the space are immediately dangerous to life or health, a confined space rescue team must be on site and ready to conduct rescue operations. Acceptable entry conditions also include the physical hazard that may be present. Examples of acceptable physical conditions might include no engulfing material in the confined space, no hazardous chemicals or materials, the space has been drained and flushed, internal temperature is less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, electrical and mechanical components in the space are locked out. All pipes to and from the space are disconnected or blocked. A rescue team is available and an attendant is present, and all entry, rescue, and monitoring equipment is in place. Before and during the entire time people are in the confined space, the attendant must continuously monitor the conditions by using remote instruments. Conditions monitored may include the internal atmosphere and temperature, lighting and condition of all people working in the space. Monitoring tests are conducted in permit spaces to determine if acceptable entry conditions are being maintained. Since many gases are heavier than air, atmospheric quality testing must be conducted at all levels and areas of a confined space, not just the entry point. The entry procedure for the specific confined space must be followed to ensure the safety of everyone who goes inside. Entry steps include filling out an entry permit, conducting a pre-entry briefing, assembling and checking all equipment, establishment of acceptable entry conditions, initial air quality monitoring, stationing of entry attendant, continuous monitoring of internal atmosphere, establishing communication between the attendant, workers, and rescue team, posting of the confined space entry permit, entry into the confined space, and a post-entry debrief if any problems were encountered. There are 3 groups of people involved in entering permit-required confined spaces: the entry supervisor, the access attendant, and the workers who will enter the confined space. The entry supervisor is responsible for supervising all aspects of the entry, knowing the hazards of the specific space, verifying the entry permit, terminating the entry and canceling the permit when entry is complete, verifying that rescue services are available, checking for safe operations in the space, and ensuring that acceptable entry conditions are maintained. The access attendant must be stationed outside the entrance and is not allowed to enter under any circumstances. The attendant is responsible for knowing the hazards of the confined space, maintaining an accurate count of entrants in the permit space, remaining outside the space during entry operations, communicating with entrants as necessary, monitoring activities inside and outside the space, summoning rescue and other emergency services if needed, performing non-entry rescue, and keeping unauthorized persons out of the space. Entrants are the workers who go inside the confined space. Their responsibilities include knowing the specific hazards of the confined space, knowing how to properly use equipment required for safe entry, communicating with the attendant as necessary, alerting the attendant of any changes or new hazards, and exiting whenever conditions change or if ordered by attendant or supervisor. Ventilation is extremely important for establishing and maintaining safe working conditions inside some confined spaces. Basic elements of confined space ventilation include conducting initial atmospheric tests before using ventilation equipment, keeping all ignition sources away from potential combustible atmospheres, and monitoring and reporting all suspected leaks into or out of confined spaces. If powered air blowers are required, you should always ventilate the confined space before entry and during the entire time people are in the space. The blower intake should be raised 10 inches above ground to reduce the possibility of intake of carbon monoxide from vehicles. Be aware of where exhaust air will exit the space. Locate the blower 5 feet away from space opening to prevent recirculating air back into the space. Keep hose length and bends to a minimum. Airflow is reduced by adding lengths of hose and bends. Be sure to locate end of vent ducts near bottom of the space. You should increase the initial purge time by 50% if the confined space atmosphere is toxic or if the space has irregular shape. Ventilation systems must be able to provide 20 air changes per hour. Consider providing direct supply ventilation to the areas occupied by workers. Use local exhaust for air contaminant sources such as welding or paint fumes. The entry supervisor must decide if supply, exhaust, local, or combination of ventilation equipment is to be used. The advantages of supply ventilation include rapid and local dilution directly at workers' breathing zone, effective air mixing, and cooling airflow that helps keep workers more comfortable. Disadvantages of supply ventilation include contaminated air discharge at the access point, overcooling of workers in cold environments, and spreading of dust or evaporation of liquids. Exhaust ventilation advantages include non-dispersion of contaminants in the confined space, discharge of contaminants away from access, localized control of contaminants, and lower airflow velocities to reduce cooling of workers in cold spaces. Exhaust ventilation disadvantages include ineffective air mixing and dilution, drawing of contaminants into worker breathing zone, and possibility of high localized air contaminant concentrations. Before entry is allowed into any permit-required confined space, a means of rescue is necessary. There are 3 types of confined space rescue procedures: self-rescue, non-entry rescue, and entry rescue. If entry to a confined space is through a lower entry point than the work area, a means must be provided to rescue entrance through a higher opening. For self-rescue, entrants are provided means to quickly leave a space if entry conditions change or signs of overexposure are noted, or if ordered by the attendant or entry supervisor. Examples include use of ladders, scaffolds, or evacuation chutes. For non-entry rescue, the attendant is provided a means of removing entrance from the confined space without the need for entering. Winches, lanyards, and cables are generally the equipment used for non-entry rescues. Entry rescues are conducted by a specially trained team that has experience in rescue from the specific type of confined space. A rescue team must be on standby during all entries into spaces that have atmospheric conditions that are immediately dangerous to life and health. Confined spaces are dangerous places. Before you enter any permit-required confined space, make sure you know the hazards and how they have been eliminated or controlled. Anyone who goes inside a confined space must be authorized and trained in entry and rescue procedures. You must also know how to use entry and rescue equipment. If you ever have any doubt about your safety or the safety of others inside a confined space, leave the area immediately and report the hazards to the entry supervisor and attendant at the access.